The day Tobias Holloway rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with a debt notice folded in his breast pocket and dust caked into the creases of his knuckles. He had no intention of staying longer than it took to collect what was owed and ride back out before sundown. It was the spring of 1878, the kind of spring that made the Kansas plains look like God had draped green velvet across the earth and forgotten to take it back. The cattle trails were busy that season, Abilene having given way to Caldwell as the preferred end point for the long drives coming up from Texas. And the town itself had that particular restless energy of a place that did not quite know what it wanted to be, part civilization, part chaos, all dust and ambition crammed between two rows of buildings that leaned against each other like tired men at a bar. Tobias was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes from years of real work rather than vanity, with dark eyes the color of strong coffee, and a jaw that had been broken once and healed slightly crooked, which gave his face a quality that women sometimes described as interesting and men sometimes described as trouble. He worked for a man named Gerald Pruitt, a creditor out of Wichita who had made a comfortable living loaning money at steep interest to ranchers who were always one bad season away from desperation. Tobias had been doing this work for 3 years, riding from town to town with ledgers and legal documents, collecting what Pruitt was owed. He was not a violent man, not by nature, but he was a firm one, and he had learned that most people paid when you made it clear that you knew exactly how much they owed and exactly how little time they had left to pay it. The debt that had brought him to Caldwell belonged to a man named Tobias Lockhart, a small-time rancher who had borrowed $420 from Pruitt's operation 2 years prior, at an interest rate that had by now nearly doubled the original sum. The file Tobias carried said Tobias Lockhart, age 44, owner of a modest spread 6 miles south of Caldwell proper, 2 head of cattle operations, no partner, no associates of record. What the file did not say, because Gerald Pruitt's records were thorough in financial matters and careless in personal ones, was that Tobias Lockhart had died of a fever the previous November, and that the property and its debts had passed to his daughter. Tobias did not know any of this when he tied his horse, a steady roan gelding named Cass, outside the Caldwell land office and stepped inside to confirm the address he had been given. The man behind the counter, a thin fellow named Aldous Webb who wore spectacles perched at the very end of his nose, peered at Tobias's document and made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a wince. Tobias Lockhart passed last autumn, Aldous said, sliding the paper back across the counter. His daughter Pearl has been running the place since. She's the one you'd be looking for if you're looking for the property or anything attached to it. Tobias took the paper back and smoothed it against his thigh. Pearl Lockhart. That's right. 23 years old and about as stubborn as that mule she keeps. She's been in town just this morning, actually. You might catch her at the general store, or she might already be headed back out. Tobias thanked the man and stepped back into the brightness of the morning. He turned toward the general store, which sat 2 buildings down on the left side of the main street, its porch crowded with barrels and a stack of feed bags, and a calico cat that regarded everything with profound indifference. He almost missed her entirely. She was standing at the far end of the porch, not shopping, not browsing, but having what appeared to be a very controlled argument with a man twice her size. The man was red-faced and gesturing with one thick hand at a paper she was holding, and she was listening to him with the particular stillness of someone who has decided not to give an inch. She was not tall, maybe 5 feet and 4 inches, with dark auburn hair pinned back under a practical wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable sun, and she wore a working dress, dusty at the hem, with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. She was not the sort of woman who made a room go quiet when she entered it, but she had something that Tobias, even at that first distance, found himself trying to name. It was the quality of her attention. The way she was completely present in that argument, unhurried and unafraid, her brown eyes steady on the man who was trying to bully her. Tobias stopped walking. He watched as she said something that made the red-faced man pull his paper back and fold it sharply and stuff it into his coat with the energy of someone who has lost a point and does not want to admit it. Then she stepped off the porch, tucked her own paper under her arm, and turned in Tobias's direction. Their eyes met for a moment. Just a moment. She had the brief, assessing look of a person accustomed to sizing up strangers quickly, and then she walked past him with the decisive step of someone who had a great many things to do before the day was through. Tobias stood there for a beat longer than he should have before he remembered why he was here. He caught up to her at the hitching post where she was untying a brown mule that was, as advertised, an animal of considerable stubbornness, currently refusing to be untied by pretending not to notice that anyone was trying. "Miss Lockhart," Tobias said. She turned, and up close the steadiness in her eyes was even more apparent. She looked at him the way she had looked at the red-faced man, assessing, calm. "I don't know you," she said. It was not unfriendly. It was simply a statement of fact. "No, ma'am. My name is Tobias Holloway. I ride for Gerald Prout out of Wichita. I'm here regarding a debt your father took on 2 years ago." He pulled the paper from his breast pocket and held it out to her, not as a threat, just as information. She looked at the paper for a moment without touching it. Then she looked at him. Something shifted behind her eyes, not fear exactly, more like the tired recognition of someone who has been waiting for a particular piece of bad news and now it has arrived. "I know about the debt," she said quietly. "I figured you might." "How much?" $780 as of last month. "The interest has been running." Something crossed her face then, fast as a cloud shadow on an open field, and was gone. She turned back to the mule and succeeded this time in convincing the animal to cooperate, looping the lead rope with practiced efficiency. "I don't have $780, Mr. Holloway," she said. "I barely cleared $300 from last season's cattle sales after I paid the feed bills and the man who helped me with the branding. I have maybe $60 in actual cash." "I understand," Tobias said, because he did, and because the tired matter-of-factness in her voice made something pull tight behind his sternum. "Mr. Prout has authorized me to discuss arrangements." She looked at him over the mule's neck. "What kind of arrangements?" "A lien on the property, or a payment schedule, or—" He paused because he knew what the third option was, and he had spoken it dozens of times without feeling much of anything. "Or surrender of the property in full settlement of the debt." Pearl Lockhart was quiet for a long moment. The street moved around them, a wagon going by, a dog trotting along the boardwalk, someone calling out from across the way, and she stood in the middle of it all with that particular stillness of hers. "That land has been in my family for 9 years, she said. "My father broke his back building that place. My mother is buried on the north slope of it. I am not surrendering that property." "Then we should discuss the other options," Tobias said. She looked at him for a moment as if she was deciding something. Then she said, "You eaten yet?" He had not actually. He had ridden since before sunup. "No," he admitted. "There's a decent eating house on the next block. Come on then, if you're going to tell me how I'm going to lose everything my father built, the least I can do is hear it sitting down with a plate in front of me." It was not an invitation anyone had ever extended to him in 3 years of doing this work, and something about it, the pragmatism of it, the dignity made Tobias follow her without another word. The eating house was run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Boone, a stout and cheerful individual who appeared to know Pearl well enough to bring her coffee without being asked. The room was plain, scrubbed tables and mismatched chairs, the smell of biscuits and something savory on the stove, and they settled across from each other in a corner table as if they had sat across from each other before, which they had not. Tobias laid the debt papers on the table between them, and Pearl set down her hat and looked at the numbers with the focused attention of someone who has had to learn arithmetic through necessity rather than schooling. "Walk me through it," she said. So he did. He explained the principle, the interest structure, the timeline. He explained it the way he would explain it to anyone clearly and without embellishment, because the facts were bad enough on their own without making them worse. And Pearl Lockhart listened. She asked 2 questions, both of them sharp and specific, about the interest calculation method and whether there was a legal challenge to the rate itself. Tobias blinked at the second question. "What do you know about interest rate challenges?" "My father's friend, a lawyer named Simmons over in Wichita, wrote me a letter in January suggesting that some of Pruitt's rate structures might not hold up if contested properly. He didn't have specifics, but he mentioned it." Tobias was quiet for a moment. It was not the first time he had heard the name Simmons in connection with Pruitt's operations, and the truth was, the lawyer was not wrong. The rates Pruitt charged were legal but barely, and there were jurisdictions in Kansas where a judge might look sideways at them. "I'm not a lawyer," Tobias said. "I know that. You're a debt collector." "I am. But you know whether what I'm describing is possible." He looked at her. The coffee was good. The biscuits which had arrived were better. Outside, Caldwell went about its business in the bright May morning. "It might be worth looking into," he said carefully, "before any agreements are signed." Pearl wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You are a strange sort of debt collector, Mr. Holloway. I've been told. Most men in your position would not be advising me to look for ways to reduce what I owe your employer. Most men in my position aren't eating biscuits with the person they came to collect from." He said it without planning to, and it came out lighter than he intended, almost like a thing a friend might say, and he watched a small, surprised smile cross her face for just a moment before she tucked it away. "Fair enough," she said. They ate and they talked, and the conversation moved beyond the debt and into the general territory of the ranch itself, because Tobias found himself asking questions and Pearl found herself answering them. She had 23 cattle currently, down from the 40 her father had kept before the illness ate into his ability to manage the operation. She had one hired hand, an older man named Hector who had worked for her father for years and who stayed on now at reduced wages because, as Pearl put it simply, he was family in the ways that counted. She had planted a small kitchen garden. She had repaired the barn roof herself last fall. She was looking into whether she could increase her herd before next year's drive season. Tobias listened to all of it and felt the slow, uncomfortable shift of a man who has arrived somewhere with a clear purpose and has begun to wonder if his purpose is the right one. He told himself it was just the biscuits. Good biscuits had a way of making a man sentimental. They agreed, by the end of the meal, that Pearl would write to the lawyer Simmons in Wichita, and that Tobias would delay his report to Pruitt by a week while she did so. It was a concession Tobias had no strict authority to make, but he made it anyway, with the internal justification that it was simply good practice to ensure the legal standing of the debt before proceeding. When they stepped back out into the street, Pearl collected her mule and looked at him sideways. "Where are you staying while you wait?" "I figured the boarding house. Mrs. Alderman's on the east end. Tell her Pearl Lockhart sent you. She'll give you the room with the window that actually opens." "I appreciate it." She gathered the mule's lead and turned to go, then paused and looked back at him with a directness that he was already starting to recognize as simply the way she looked at things. "I'm not going to make this easy for you, Mr. Holloway," she said. "Not the debt and not any of the rest of it. I want you to know that up front." "I figured as much, Miss Lockhart," he said. She nodded once, as if they had agreed to something, and then she and the mule walked south out of town together in the long gold light of the morning. Tobias stood and watched them go longer than he had any good reason to. The week that followed had a quality Tobias struggled to put a name to. He was, on the surface, waiting for the letter to Simmons to be sent and a reply to come back, waiting to see what the legal situation truly was, waiting to report to Pruitt. He was good at waiting when he needed to be, but this particular waiting had a different texture to it, because on the second day Pearl Lockhart came back into town for supplies, and they crossed paths again outside the general store, and she said, without any particular preamble, that she needed an extra pair of hands to help move some fence posts, and would he be willing to earn his keep while he was waiting around doing nothing? He said yes before he finished thinking about it. The Lockhart spread was 6 miles south of town, and riding out there in the warm May morning with Pearl on the seat of a wagon and Cass tied at the back felt like stepping into a different world from the one Tobias usually inhabited. The Kansas plains stretched out wide and flat and green, the sky enormous above them, and Pearl drove with the easy competence of someone who had made this drive 1,000 times without needing to think about it. Hector was waiting at the property line, a wiry man in his mid-50s with a face like worn saddle leather and eyes that were friendly but watchful. He looked at Tobias with the particular assessment of a man who was protective of someone he cared about. "This the fella from Wichita," he said to Pearl as if Tobias might not be able to hear him. "This is Mr. Holloway," Pearl said. "He's going to help with the fence line today," said Hector. Then to Tobias directly, "You know how to dig a post hole." "I've dug a few," Tobias said. "Good. There's a difference between a man who says he can work and a man who actually can. We'll see which one you are." It was the kind of test a man could either resent or rise to, and Tobias, who had grown up doing real labor before he ended up in the complicated business of debt collection, rose to it. They spent the morning working the fence line on the property's eastern boundary, and by noon, when Pearl came out with water and cold biscuits from the morning, Hector had modified his assessment enough to address Tobias by his first name. "You're not what I expected," Pearl said to Tobias at noon, while Hector rested in the shade of a fence post. "What did you expect?" She considered this with genuine seriousness, as she considered most things. "Someone colder," she said finally. "Prute's men have come around before, when my father was sick. They weren't kind about it." The image of that settled on Tobias in an uncomfortable way. Elias Lockhart, ill and frightened, being leaned on by men doing the same job Tobias did. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "It wasn't your fault." "No, but it matters to me that you know I wouldn't have." He stopped himself. Pearl looked at him. "Wouldn't have what?" "Wouldn't have been that way," he said quietly. She held his gaze for a moment, and in the silence between them, with the Kansas wind moving through the grass and Hector very deliberately looking at the horizon, something shifted. Something small and significant, like a door not quite opening but moving on its hinges for the first time. "I'm starting to think you might be right about that," Pearl said. The letter to Simmons in Wichita went out that same afternoon, and in the meantime Tobias found himself returning to the Lockhart spread over the following days in a way that required increasingly creative justification. He helped repair a section of the barn roof that Pearl had patched imperfectly. He rode out to assess the grazing land to the south, because Pearl said she was considering whether to expand there and wanted a second opinion. He spent an evening at the kitchen table looking at the ranch's actual books, because Prute's ledger and what Pearl kept in her own neat handwriting did not quite match, and the discrepancy was worth understanding. The kitchen was warm in the evenings, lit by oil lamp, and Pearl worked alongside him at the table without self-consciousness, her hair loose from its pins by then, a cup of coffee at her elbow and Hector in his chair by the fire with his boots off. It felt, in a way that should have alarmed Tobias but somehow did not, like home. "You're better at this than I expected," Pearl said one evening, looking over the figures he had laid out. "What numbers?" "No," she paused, looking for the right word. "Being a person." He laughed, which surprised them both, because Tobias Holloway was not a man who laughed easily, and the sound of it seemed to surprise the kitchen into a brief, warm quiet. "I don't know if that's a compliment," he said. "It is," she said simply, and went back to the figures. By the 5th day, the letter from Simmons had not yet come back, but something else had arrived. A second man from Prute's operation, a fellow named Vernon Slake, who was everything Tobias was not. He was sharp-faced and impatient and had the manner of a man who enjoyed delivering bad news. He rode up to the Lockhart spread on the 5th morning while Tobias was helping Hector with the cattle, and he brought with him an updated notice from Prute that did not account for any delay, and did not acknowledge any pending legal inquiry. "Pruett's patience has run out," Vernon announced, from the back of a mean-looking gray horse, to no one in particular and everyone simultaneously. "The property is to be assessed, and the foreclosure proceedings initiated by end of week." Pearl stood in the yard and looked at Vernon Slake with the same calm she brought to everything, but Tobias, who was standing 15 feet away and watching her face, saw something beneath the calm that he recognized as fear held carefully at bay. "There is a legal inquiry pending," Tobias said, stepping forward. "I authorized a 1-week extension pending clarification of the debt's legal standing." Vernon turned to look at Tobias with undisguised contempt. "You don't have authority to authorize extensions. Pruitt was clear about that when he sent me. Your job was to collect Holloway, not to play house out here in the prairie." The words "play house" were calculated to sting, and they did, but not in the way Vernon intended. They stung because they named, badly and mockingly, something that had been growing quietly in Tobias's chest all week, something he had not yet allowed himself to look at directly. "The legal inquiry is legitimate," Tobias said evenly. "Simmons in Wichita is reviewing the interest rate structure. If the rate is found to be outside the acceptable range under Kansas lending law, the amount owed is substantially less than the current figure, and any foreclosure on the current figure would be contestable in court." Vernon stared at him. "You've been helping her." "I've been doing my job correctly," Tobias said. "Your job is to bring Pruitt his money. My job is to handle this debt legally and professionally, and that's what I'm doing." The two men looked at each other across the yard, and Hector very quietly stepped to stand slightly beside and behind Pearl in the way of a man who has decided which side of a line he is on. Vernon Slake looked at Pearl for a long, unpleasant moment. "Pruitt will hear about this," he said. "He's your employer," Tobias said. "You can tell him whatever you like." Vernon pulled his horse around and rode back toward the road, and the yard was quiet for a moment, the only sound the cattle moving in the distance and the wind doing its endless work in the grass. Pearl exhaled slowly. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Tobias said. "He's going to tell Pruitt. I might lose my position over this." Pearl looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something softer than her usual directness, something that made him feel seen in a way he was not accustomed to. "Would that be the worst thing?" she asked. He had no answer for that, at least not one he was ready to give. The letter from Simmons arrived the following morning, brought out to the ranch by the young boy who handled deliveries in Caldwell. Pearl read it at the kitchen table with Tobias sitting across from her and Hector leaning in the doorway trying to look like he was not listening. The letter was clear. Simmons believed that Pruitt's interest rate, applied at the interval and percentage documented in the original loan agreement, exceeded the informal usury standards that Kansas courts had been applying in recent years. It was not a guarantee, but it was a strong opinion, and Simmons was willing to take the matter to a judge in Wichita on Pearl's behalf for a modest fee, with the expectation that the court would either reduce the debt significantly or invalidate the interest accumulation entirely, leaving only the original principal of $420, an amount Pearl could conceivably manage. Pearl set the letter down and pressed her fingers flat against it on the table. Her eyes were bright. She blinked twice quickly, and Tobias understood that she was doing the private work of not crying, which he respected enormously. "It's not certain yet," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "But it's possible, it's actually possible." "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked up at him, and the brightness in her eyes was still there, and something else with it, something that looked very much like gratitude but was warmer than gratitude and more complicated. "Come on," she said, standing abruptly. "I need some air. Will you ride out with me? I want to show you something." They rode out to the north slope of the property in the late morning, and it was there that Pearl showed him her mother's grave, which was marked with a simple stone and surrounded by a low fence that Tobias Lockhart had built with his own hands. There were wildflowers growing around it in the May warmth, blues and yellows scattered across the green. My mother died when I was 12, Pearl said from the back of her horse. This land was already hers before it was my father's, technically. Her family homesteaded here in 1869. My father came out from Missouri and married her in 1870, and they built the house together. She paused. When he died in November, I sat here for a long time and asked her what to do. I don't know if I believe she answered, but I felt something clarify. I knew I wasn't going to give this up. Tobias looked at the grave and at the wildflowers and at the immense sweep of land around them, and he understood something then about Pearl Lockhart that went beyond her stubbornness or her practicality or even her courage. She was a woman who knew what she was fighting for and why, with the kind of clarity that most people spend their whole lives searching for. "She'd be proud of you," he said. It was a simple thing to say and perhaps predictable, but Pearl turned to look at him with an expression that suggested it was not a thing she had heard recently enough. "You think so?" "I think so," he said, and meant it with a conviction that surprised him a little. They sat there on the north slope for a while longer than was strictly necessary, talking about things that had nothing to do with debts or legal proceedings, about Missouri, where Tobias had grown up, the third of 5 children on a farm that always needed more rain than it got, about Pearl's childhood on this land, learning to ride before she could properly read, her mother teaching her to identify every wildflower by name, about what they had wanted to be, both of them, before life had assigned them different shapes. Pearl had wanted to be a school teacher. She had studied for it, taken correspondence courses, and then her mother had died and her father had needed her, and the ranch had needed her, and the teaching had stayed a dream she kept carefully in a drawer, taken out sometimes and examined and then put away again. Tobias had wanted at one point to study law. He had read whatever he could get his hands on. He had ended up in debt collection not because he wanted to, but because it paid steadily and he was good at it, and good enough was often what life offered when you ran short of excellent. "You could still do it," Pearl said. "Study law. You're clearly already thinking like a lawyer, the way you talk to that Slake man." "I'm 28, Tobias said, as if that settled something. Pearl looked at him with the particular exasperation of a woman who has no patience for self-imposed limitations. "So," he looked at her, and the afternoon light was coming across the north slope in a long golden pour, and Pearl Lockhart was sitting straight on her horse in the middle of all that gold with an expression on her face that said quite clearly that she thought he was being foolish. He felt something warm and terrifying open up in his chest, like a window that had been stuck for years finally giving way. That evening, Vernon Slake rode back out to the property with a formal notice that Prout had instructed him to deliver. Tobias Holloway's employment with Prout's lending operation was terminated, effective immediately. The debt collection process would be handed to a firm in Wichita that Prout retained for contested cases. Any legal proceedings initiated by the debtor were to be addressed through that firm. Tobias read the notice in the lamplight and felt something he had not expected to feel: relief. Clean, uncomplicated relief, like setting down a weight he had carried long enough to forget it was heavy. Hector, observing from his chair, said nothing. But he topped up Tobias's coffee without being asked. Pearl, reading the notice over Tobias's shoulder, said very quietly, "I'm sorry, this is my fault." "It isn't," Tobias said. "You helped me, and now you've lost your position. Miss Lockhart." He turned to look at her, and she was very close, having been reading over his shoulder, and neither of them moved back. "I've lost a job I should have left a year ago. That's different from losing something that mattered." She was quiet for a moment, close enough that he could see the detail of her eyes in the lamplight, the specific brown of them that was not just brown but had amber in it, the color of honey held up to a candle. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I haven't quite worked that out yet," he said honestly. She nodded slowly. "You could stay on here for a while if you wanted. There's always work that needs doing, and I can't pay much, but I can pay something, and the room in the barn loft is clean and dry." Hector made a sound that might have been a cough and might have been something else entirely. Tobias looked at Pearl Lockhart in the lamplight and thought about Kansas, which he had always been passing through on his way somewhere else, and about a barn loft and work that was honest and a woman with amber in her eyes who had no patience for self-imposed limitations. "I'd be grateful for that," he said. The legal case moved through the summer with the slow, grinding patience that the legal system seemed to consider a virtue. Simmons in Wichita filed the appropriate motions, and Proots retained firm, filed responses, and the judge assigned to the matter set a hearing date for late August. In the meantime, Pearl and Tobias and Hector ran the ranch. The summer of 1878 in southern Kansas was hot enough to make the air shimmer at noon and the cattle restless and the work relentless. And Tobias had not worked physically like this in years, and it suited him. He was up before dawn with Hector, out with the cattle in the blue-gray light, and the work had a rhythm and a satisfaction that his desk-hand ledger life in Wichita had never offered. He was good with the animals, it turned out, which surprised him and pleased Hector, who had adjusted his assessment of Tobias over the weeks from tolerated stranger to something approaching genuine regard. Pearl worked alongside them without making any distinction between her labor and theirs, which was both admirable and occasionally alarming, because she would climb things and lift things and ride out in weather that was not suitable, and Tobias found himself watching over her with an attentiveness that he told himself was simply practical concern for an employer's safety, and which he knew, somewhere below that justification, was something else entirely. They fell into a friendship that was comfortable in the way that real friendship always is, the kind built not from intention, but from shared meals and shared work, and the natural rhythm of two people occupying the same space honestly. They talked about everything, in the evenings on the porch or during the long rides to check the southern grazing land. Pearl told him about the particular characters of each of their cattle, which she had named, and Tobias did not tease her about this because he found it charming in a way he would not have been able to explain to Vernon Slake or Gerald Prout. Tobias told her about his family in Missouri, his youngest sister who was studying to be a nurse, his father who had died the winter before and left the farm to his older brother, which had been the right decision but had still carried a grief in it. There was a night in July when a thunderstorm came up fast across the plains, the kind of violent prairie storm that seems to materialize from clear sky with almost no warning, and Tobias was in the yard when the lightning started, and Pearl was at the south fence line checking on a heifer that had been having trouble. He rode out for her in the rain without thinking, and they rode back together in the dark with lightning splitting the sky above them, and the rain coming sideways, and Pearl, who was not a woman who scared easily, was very close beside him on the narrow trail. When they got back to the yard and made it into the barn, both soaked through and breathless from the ride, they stood in the hay-smelling dark with the storm hammering the roof, and Pearl turned to look at him. And she was laughing not from hysteria, but from genuine delight at the wildness of it, at being alive in the middle of all that elemental noise, and Tobias Holloway looked at her laughing in the half-dark of the barn, and he knew. He knew the way you know certain things in certain moments, with a clarity that bypasses thought entirely and lands somewhere deeper. He knew that this woman was going to matter to him in a way that nothing else in his 28 years had mattered yet. He did not say anything about it that night. He helped with the frightened cattle and then walked back through the mud to the barn loft and lay awake in the dark listening to the storm ease off and thinking about how thoroughly and completely his plans had changed without his permission. The hearing in Wichita was set for the 22nd of August, and Pearl and Tobias made the trip together, leaving Hector in charge of the ranch. The drive to Wichita took 2 days, and they traveled in the wagon with a packed lunch that Pearl had prepared with the same unsentimental practicality she brought to everything. Simmons was a small, precise man with a white beard and an expression of habitual seriousness that softened somewhat when he shook Pearl's hand and said that he had liked her father very much. He walked them through the case with thoroughness, and Tobias, sitting in Simmons's office, found himself asking questions that were genuinely lawyerly in their precision and caught Simmons looking at him speculatively twice. "What did you do before debt collection?" Simmons asked him near the end of the meeting. "Farming," Tobias said, "and reading whatever law I could find." Simmons nodded slowly. "I might have a use for a man like you, if things go well here tomorrow and if you find yourself without a set direction. I'm getting older and I have more cases than I can manage properly. I'm not offering partnership, mind you. Not yet. But there's learning to be done if someone wants to do it." Tobias looked at Pearl, and Pearl was looking at her coffee cup with a small smile that she was trying to keep to herself, and Tobias felt something so warm in his chest that he had to look away. The judge heard the case the following morning, in a wood-paneled room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. Pruitt's Wichita firm sent a competent attorney named Farrow, who argued the original agreement's terms with professional smoothness. Simmons argued the interest rate excess with a quiet, surgical precision that Tobias found himself admiring enormously. Pearl sat beside Tobias in the gallery and did not move and barely breathed for the entirety of it. When the judge issued his finding 3 hours later, it was not a complete victory. Judges in 1878 rarely handed those out, but it was close. The interest accumulation above the principal was invalidated as exceeding acceptable lending standards. The amount Pearl Lockhart legally owed was reduced to the original $420, with a payment schedule of $20 per month, which was aggressive but manageable. Pearl was very quiet for a moment when Simmons read them the finding in the hallway outside the courtroom. Then she said, "So I keep the ranch." "You keep the ranch," Simmons confirmed. And Pearl Lockhart, who had been steady through every piece of bad news and every difficult morning and every moment of the past months, pressed her hand briefly over her mouth and closed her eyes, and Tobias, standing beside her, did the only thing that felt right, which was to take her other hand in both of his. She let him. They rode back to Caldwell over 2 days, and this time the journey had a different quality to it, lighter in some way, the compressed urgency of the legal situation having released. They camped the first night on the open plain, a small fire between them and the stars enormous overhead, the kind of sky that Kansas offered in abundance and that never quite became ordinary. Pearl told him about the first winter she had been on the ranch without her mother, age 12, learning to do things she had never done because the things needed doing. She told it without self-pity, just as information, and Tobias listened and understood that this was a woman who had been forging herself on difficult circumstances for over a decade, and the result was something remarkable. "You've been carrying a lot on your own for a long time," he said. She looked at the fire. "Most people carry what they have to." "That's true, but not everyone carries it as well as you do." She was quiet for a moment. "You see me very clearly," she said, and there was something uncertain in her voice for the first time, something that was almost vulnerable, as if his seeing her clearly was something that made her feel exposed rather than simply seen. "I'm sorry if that's unwelcome," he said. "It's not," she said quietly. "It's just not something I'm used to." They looked at each other across the small fire, and the night was very still around them, and Tobias thought about all the things he wanted to say and sorted them in his mind, and found that the right one was not words at all, not yet. He wanted to give her time. He wanted to be sure. But he reached into the inside band of his hat, his worn, good hat that had traveled many hundreds of miles across Kansas, and he took out the small stub of pencil he kept there for noting things down, and he wrote her name on the inside of the brim, Pearl Lockhart. He did it without quite deciding to, and when he looked at it, he understood that he had been going to do this from the moment he had first heard her name spoken in the land office by a man in spectacles, and had only needed the right moment to make it real. She was looking at the fire and did not see him do it. He put the hat back on and kept the thing to himself like a private promise he had made to the night. They returned to the Lockhart Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late August. to find Hector sitting on the porch with a look of cautious good news, and 24 cattle in the south field, where there had been 23 when they left. The heifer that had been having trouble had delivered a calf while they were gone, healthy and loud, and already investigating the world with the confident energy of the newly arrived. "Boy or girl?" Pearl asked, climbing down from the wagon. "Bull calf," Hector said. "Fine-looking animal." Pearl went to see the calf immediately, climbing the fence in her traveling dress with no concern for decorum, and Tobias watched her lean down to look at the calf with that wholehearted delight. She turned on things she loved, and Hector came to stand beside him, and they both watched Pearl and the new calf for a moment. "You're staying," Hector said. It was not a question. "If she'll have me," Tobias said. Said Hector, which was his way of indicating that he had known this for some time and was not surprised by it. September came in gold and blue, the heat releasing its grip on the plains in the way it did every year, and the ranch work shifted into the patterns of fall. The monthly payments to Pruitt's firm began, and Pearl managed them with the determined precision of someone crossing days off a calendar, and the knowledge that the land was secure under her feet changed something in her posture, something subtle and profound. She stood easier, laughed more often, let herself plan. Tobias had written to Simmons accepting the offer of a position, not partnership, not yet, but the studying and the learning that Simmons had mentioned, with the understanding that Tobias would remain in Caldwell for the time being and make the trip to Wichita when casework required it. It was an unusual arrangement, but Simmons was an unusual man, and he seemed to find Tobias's situation, employed part-time on a ranch and part-time in legal study, more sensible than most people would have. The riding between Caldwell and Wichita was not so different from the riding Tobias had done as a debt collector, and it had the same quality of being alone on the open land with time to think. He thought, on those rides, mostly about Pearl. He thought about the way she listened to things fully before she responded to them. He thought about how she treated Hector with the specific tenderness of someone who understood that loyalty deserved honoring. He thought about the way she had looked on the north slope in the May morning, and in the barn in the lightning-lit dark, and across the fire with the stars overhead. He thought about her name written on the inside of his hat, and whether it was foolish, and decided that it was not. He came back from his second Wichita trip in early October to find Pearl in the kitchen in the evening, working on the ranch accounts with the lamp turned up high and a coffee gone cold at her elbow. She looked up when he came in, and her face did the thing it had been doing lately, lit briefly with something before settling back into its usual composure. "How was Wichita?" she asked. "Useful," he said. "Simmons had me help draft a motion." He said it was the best first draft he'd seen from someone without formal training. Her face lit up properly this time, without the composure catching it first. "Tobias, that's wonderful." He sat down across from her and realized that he was done waiting for a better moment or clearer circumstances. The thing in his chest had been building for months, and it was not going to become less real for being contained any longer. "Pearl," he said. She looked at him. Something in his voice must have changed because she set her pen down and gave him her full attention, which was the kind of attention that made a person feel that nothing else existed. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. I came here in May to collect a debt, and I'm going to stay here as long as you'll let me, for reasons that have nothing to do with debts or ranches or legal work." He paused. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, and I don't want to presume anything about what you might feel, but it doesn't seem honest to keep not saying it." Pearl looked at him for a long moment. The lamp made the amber in her eyes very warm. "What is it you're not saying?" she asked, and her voice was careful, precise, as if she wanted to hear the exact words and not a summary of them. "I love you," Tobias said. "I think I have been falling in love with you since you argued down that red-faced man on the store porch in May, and then invited me to breakfast like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I know I have been since the night of the storm, in the barn." Pearl was very still. "I'm not asking for anything," Tobias said. I'm just telling you because I think you deserve to know things clearly, and I think I've been not saying it long enough." Pearl looked at the lamp for a moment. Then she looked at the account she had been working on. Then she looked at Tobias Holloway, who was sitting across from her, being honest with the particular courage of someone who has decided that honesty matters more than its outcome. "I've been telling myself it was gratitude," she said. "What I felt. Because you helped me and you stayed, and because—" She stopped. "But it isn't gratitude. I know the difference. Gratitude is a simple feeling, and this is not a simple feeling at all." "No," he agreed, "it isn't. I've been frightened of it," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise. I've been running this place alone for a year, and I know how to do that now, and there's a kind of security in it, in knowing you can manage on your own. The thought of needing someone again—" "I'm not asking you to need me," Tobias said. "I'm not asking you to depend on me. You're the most capable person I have ever known, and nothing about me loving you changes a single thing about who you are or what you can do." He looked at her steadily. "I just want to be in the same place as you, that's all." Something loosened in Pearl's expression, something she had been holding carefully, and she said, very quietly, "I love you too. I have for a while now. I've been very annoyed about it." Tobias laughed, and Pearl laughed, and Hector, who was absolutely listening from the next room, made no sound at all but was clearly not asleep. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was two people at a kitchen table in the lamplight in the fall, both of them honest, both of them a little afraid, both of them deciding that the fear was worth what was on the other side of it. Tobias reached across the table and took her hand, and Pearl turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed there for a long, quiet moment that needed nothing added to it. The courtship that followed was, in its way, perfectly suited to the place and time and people involved. It was not a courtship of grand gestures or elaborate performances. It was a courtship of presence and work, and the slow accumulation of small moments that each meant something. It was Tobias riding out with her in the early mornings to check the cattle, the two of them side by side on the open land in the first light, talking sometimes and sometimes just riding together in the particular ease of two people who do not need to fill silence. It was Pearl appearing at the barn loft with a plate of food when Tobias was working late on the legal papers Simmons sent, and sitting on the loft ladder while he ate and telling him what she had been reading. It was the moment in November when the first hard frost came, and they stood together on the porch, watching the plains go silver, and Tobias put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side with the uncomplicated ease of someone coming to rest. It was also, because Pearl was Pearl, arguments, 2 or 3 real ones, the kind that come in any honest relationship between two people who both have strong opinions about the direction of the ranch's expansion. About Tobias taking on too much legal work and coming back from Wichita exhausted. About a moment in town when Pearl thought Tobias had been dismissive of something she said in front of others, which he had not intended but which was fair for her to name. These arguments had the particular quality of arguments between people who respect each other. They were direct, they were honest, and they ended. Hector watched all of this with the expression of a man who had long since made peace with matters beyond his control. Tobias had been writing to his sister Margaret in Missouri through the fall, and in December he received a letter back in which Margaret, who was perceptive, said that, from the way he described Kansas these days, she could only conclude that either the state itself had dramatically improved or there was something else entirely, and which one was it? He wrote back that it was both, in a sense, and that he would tell her more in person when he could. He proposed to Pearl on a December evening, not in the kitchen this time, but on the north slope where her mother's grave was, because it seemed to him that the people who mattered to Pearl should be present in some way for the things that mattered to her. He had not planned a speech. He had a ring, a simple gold band he had bought in Wichita with the money from his first 2 months of work with Simmons, and he said what he felt, which was that he had come to this place looking for something that was not really his and had found something that was, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life being the kind of man who deserved what he had found. Pearl looked at the ring for a moment, and then she looked at him, and she said yes in the way she said most important things, plainly and completely, without decoration. And then she held out her hand, and he put the ring on it, and they stood together on the north slope in the December cold with the brown grass around them, and the wide Kansas sky above, and the grave of a woman Pearl had loved and Tobias had never met but felt he knew. And the moment was one of those moments that a person carries intact through the rest of their life. They were married in the spring of 1879, in the second week of April, at a small ceremony in the Caldwell church that was attended by Hector and Mrs. Clara Boone from the eating house and Aldous Webb from the land office, and a handful of Caldwell residents who had come to know Pearl Lockhart and who approved, with the collective wisdom of small communities, of the man she had chosen. Tobias's sister Margaret had made the trip from Missouri, which had required considerable planning, and which resulted in Margaret and Pearl taking to each other with the immediate ease of two women who recognize a shared quality of directness. And Tobias stood in the church and watched his two favorite people in the world become friends, and felt a happiness so thorough and uncomplicated that it was almost unfamiliar. The ceremony was simple. The words were the old words, and they meant the things they had always meant. And when Tobias Holloway looked at Pearl Lockhart as she said them, he thought of a May morning and a porch argument and a cup of coffee and the careful record of his own heart learning something it had not known it needed to learn. After the ceremony, when they were standing outside in the April sunshine with the town around them and Hector actually smiling, which was notable, Tobias took his hat off in the warmth of the day, and Pearl, who had never seen the inside of it, glanced at it as he held it and saw the writing there. She took the hat from him gently and looked at it. Pearl Lockhart written in pencil on the inside of the brim, slightly faded but still clear. "When did you do this?" she asked. "The night we camped on the way back from Wichita," he said. "In August, you were looking at the fire." She looked at the name, her name, written inside the hat of a man who had arrived in Caldwell in May with a debt notice and ridden away from the business of collecting other people's money in order to stay somewhere he had not intended to be. "Tobias Holloway," she said. "Yes. You are a very unusual man. I've been told," he said. She handed the hat back to him and looked up at him in the April light, and the amber was in her eyes, and she was his wife, and Caldwell was bright around them, and the debt that had brought him here had been paid and resolved and was no longer anybody's concern, and the name inside his hat was no longer Lockhart but was still Pearl, and it would always be Pearl. He put the hat back on. The first year of their marriage had the quality of a thing being built well. Tobias was in Caldwell more than Wichita now, because Simmons had agreed to an arrangement that allowed most of the legal work to be done at a distance, with correspondence and careful record-keeping and periodic trips when court appearances required it. He had converted the small side room of the ranch house into a proper workspace, with the books Simmons had sent, and the legal texts he was working through with the focused determination he had been applying to things since he was old enough to apply it to anything. Pearl expanded the herd. By the fall of 1879, she had 30 cattle, an increase managed with the careful strategic attention she brought to all ranch business. The monthly payments to Pruitt's firm were being made without fail, and Pearl tracked them in her neat handwriting with the satisfaction of someone systematically dismantling a problem. She had also, quietly, begun corresponding with Simmons about the possibility of challenging the original debt terms more aggressively, not for herself. Her deal was done, and she was managing it, but because she had heard from two other small ranchers in the area who had taken loans from similar operations on similar terms and were being crushed under the same impossible arithmetic. This was not something Tobias had suggested. It was something Pearl had arrived at on her own, because Pearl was the kind of person who, once she understood a problem and understood that the problem was bigger than her own situation, wanted to do something about the larger version of it. Simmons, when he heard about it, told Tobias that his wife was a considerable person, which Tobias already knew, but appreciated hearing from someone with Simmons's economy of admiration. They worked on it together in the evenings, Tobias providing the legal framework and Pearl providing the knowledge of the ranching community. Who had borrowed from whom, under what terms, how the pressure had been applied, who was most vulnerable. It was collaboration of a very particular and satisfying kind, the work of two people who were good at different things that together made something better than either alone. There was a night in October when they sat up very late working through the documents for the first of the neighboring rancher cases. A man named Joseph Calvert, who had 3 children and $40 in his pocket, and a foreclosure notice that Simmons thought could be challenged on the same grounds as Pearl's. The lamp was low and both of them were tired, and Pearl made a mistake in her arithmetic and caught it herself, and said a word under her breath that was not a word generally expected from women in 1879. Tobias looked up from his papers. Pearl looked back at him with perfect dignity. "Arithmetic," she said, by way of explanation. "Understandable," Tobias said. And then they were both laughing in the low-lit room, the same way they had laughed in the church in April and in the kitchen in October of the year before, the laughter of two people who have found in each other the specific and irreplaceable pleasure of finding something funny at the same moment. Tobias reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and Pearl leaned her face briefly into his hand, and outside the October wind moved through the grass in the dark. The case of Joseph Calvert was resolved the following spring in a Wichita courtroom, with Simmons arguing and Tobias present as his assistant, to a similar outcome as Pearl's, the usurious interest component invalidated, the debt reduced to a manageable principal. Joseph Calvert shook Tobias's hand outside the courthouse with the particular grip of a man who has just been handed back something he thought was gone forever, and said that he didn't know how to thank a man like him. "Talk to the other ranchers," Tobias said, "the ones in the same situation, and tell them that there are legal options." It was the beginning of what became, over the next year, something of a small and informal legal practice. Not formal. Tobias was not yet a properly admitted attorney. That would come later, but a recognized service to the farming and ranching community in southern Kansas, working alongside Simmons, helping people who had been taken advantage of by the aggressive lending operations that had proliferated in the territory. It was work that mattered in a way that collecting other people's debts had never mattered, and it made Tobias Holloway, in ways he felt clearly but would have been embarrassed to articulate, a happier man. Pearl, for her part, began the teaching she had always wanted to do. Not formally, there was a school in Caldwell, but it was staffed, but she began holding what she called reading hours on Saturday mornings at the ranch, for the children of nearby homesteads who were too far from town to attend school regularly. 4 children came the first Saturday, 7 the second. By summer there were 12, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and Pearl taught them reading and writing and arithmetic and geography from the books she had, and she was, by all accounts including those of the children themselves, a natural. Tobias came to watch once, standing in the doorway of the room they had set up for it, and Pearl was at the front of the room explaining long division to a 10-year-old girl who was struggling with it. And Pearl was patient in a way that was not the patience of someone waiting for something to be over, but the patience of someone who genuinely believed the 10-year-old would get it if she found the right door into the idea. And the girl did get it eventually, and her face opened up with understanding, and Pearl's face opened up with the same understanding, and Tobias stood in the doorway and felt very, very fortunate. He did not say this to Pearl immediately. He thought about it all day, out on the southern grazing land checking the fence line with Hector. And Hector, who had a gift for sensing when something was being quietly considered, said nothing and let him consider it. That evening after supper, he told Pearl that he thought what she was doing with the Saturday school was one of the finest things he had seen anyone do, and that her mother, who he still felt he knew through the grave on the north slope and through the love Pearl carried for her, would have thought so too. Pearl stood at the sink and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, without turning around, "Will you say something if I ask you something personal?" "Always," he said. She turned around and her expression was the uncertain one, the one she rarely showed, the one from the fire and the October kitchen and a handful of other moments that he counted among his most important. "Do you want children, our own children? I've been thinking about it, but I wasn't sure how to. I didn't want to assume." "Yes," he said simply. "Very much," she breathed. "Good," she said. "Good, because I think I would like that." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, which in the telling of it sounds simple, but in the experience of it was the kind of thing that contains within it everything two people have built together and everything they are proposing to build. And the kitchen was warm, and outside the May night was coming in across the plains. Their son was born in March of 1881, on a morning that arrived cold and clear after a difficult labor that lasted much of the night. And Hector rode to town for the midwife in the dark and sat on the porch through the whole of it, and was there when the sound of a baby crying came through the wood of the wall, and he put his face briefly in his hands and stayed like that for a moment, which was as much feeling as Hector ever showed at once. They named the boy Elias, for Pearl's father, with Thomas as a middle name, for Tobias's own father who had died before any of this began. And the naming felt right in the way that certain things feel right, as if the names had been waiting. Tobias Holloway was, from the beginning, a person of strong opinions and loud expression, which both of his parents took as a very good sign. He was dark-haired like Tobias with Pearl's particular brown-amber eyes, and he regarded the world with an alertness that Pearl recognized as familiar. Hector, who had never been a man demonstrably given to sentiment, became with Elias a man of considerable softness. He spent hours sitting with the baby with the ease of someone for whom this kind of thing was new but felt natural, and when Elias was old enough to reach for things and chose, one afternoon, to grab Hector's calloused hand and hold it with the full strength of both of his small ones, Hector looked at Tobias over the baby's head with an expression that required no translation. The Caldwell years built themselves up like layers of good soil. Tobias was admitted to practice law in Kansas in 1882, having passed the bar examination with Simmons's guidance after 2 years of serious study, and he opened a modest office in Caldwell that handled ranching disputes and land title matters, and periodically, challenges to lending agreements like the one that had brought him here in the first place. He thought of that sometimes, Gerald Prout, sitting in his Wichita office, sending a debt collector south with a folded notice in his breast pocket. The strange arithmetic of consequence and luck, and the particular grace of being exactly wrong about your own plans. Pearl paid off the last of the debt in the fall of 1883, the final $20 payment made to the firm that had taken over Prout's operation, and she crossed the last item off in her ledger and sat with it for a moment before she called Tobias in from his office and showed him. "That's done," she said. He looked at the ledger, at the neat row of crossed-off entries that represented 5 years of careful monthly payments, and he thought about the first time he had sat across a table from her and laid the debt papers out and watched her face do its work of not quite flinching. "That's done," he agreed. They celebrated with a supper that Pearl cooked with the same effort she brought to everything, and Hector was there, and Margaret had written to say she was visiting in the spring and that she couldn't wait to see the boy, and Elias, who was 2 and therefore an authority on all things, was emphatic in his opinions about what went on his plate. By the time their daughter arrived in 1884, named Clara Margaret, for Mrs. Boone of the eating house who had died the previous winter and whom Pearl had genuinely loved, and for Margaret Holloway, who was still very much alive and delighted to be honored in this way, the Lockhart ranch was no longer just surviving. It was flourishing. The herd was 60 strong. The Saturday school had grown into something more organized, with Pearl advocating for and eventually receiving the support of the Caldwell School Board, who were late to recognize what they had in Pearl Holloway but eventually got there. Tobias's legal practice was steady and respected, and the work he had done for the ranching community over the years had built him a reputation as a man who could be trusted. The town itself was changing. Caldwell was becoming more settled, the wildness of the cattle drive years giving way to a more permanent kind of civilization, and there were families here now who had come to stay rather than to pass through. Pearl was part of that permanence. She had roots here that went down 12 feet, through her and through her father and through her mother who rested on the north slope. Tobias had come as a visitor and had become permanent in the way that some things do, not by intention, but by the deep rightness of belonging somewhere at last. There was an evening in the fall of 1885, when Elias was 4 and Clara was 1, and Hector was 60, and still out with the cattle every morning, as if age were simply a personal opinion he declined to hold, when Tobias and Pearl sat together on the porch in the last of the October light, and the plains were gold, and the sky was that particular deep blue that comes just before dark, and the house behind them was warm and full of everything they had made together. Pearl had her head on Tobias's shoulder, which was something she had taken to in the years of their marriage, this easy way of being close to him that required nothing and meant everything, and they were quiet together in the good way. "Do you think about what would have happened," Pearl said, "if Prude had sent someone different?" Tobias thought about it honestly. "Someone who wouldn't have looked twice at the legal question," he said, "who would have pushed the foreclosure through." "Yes, you would have contested it," he said, because he believed this absolutely. "You would have found Simmons yourself eventually, you would have fought it." "Maybe," Pearl said, "but it would have been different, harder, longer." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad it was you." He turned and pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she made a small sound of contentment that was one of his favorite sounds in the world. Elias was somewhere behind them in the house, narrating something to himself in the self-assured way of 4-year-olds, and Clara was asleep in her cradle, and the cattle were in for the night, and the October dark was coming in across the plains as it always did, as it had since before any of them were here, as it would when they were long gone. "I'm glad it was me too," Tobias said. He thought about a May morning and a folded piece of paper, and a woman arguing on a porch with a kind of calm that had stopped him in the street. He thought about biscuits and legal papers, and a north slope in the winter cold, and a barn in the lightning dark. He thought about the inside of his hat, where a name was still written in faded pencil, a name that was now also his name, half of what he was called and all of what he loved. "I came here with a list of things I was supposed to take," he said. Pearl smiled against his shoulder. "And what did you leave with?" He did not hesitate. "Everything," he said. Above them the Kansas sky finished darkening into something vast and quiet and full of stars, and the October wind came through the grass, and behind them the house held its warmth, and Pearl Lockhart, who had become Pearl Holloway without becoming anyone other than herself, stayed right where she was, and Tobias Holloway, who had arrived in Caldwell in the spring of 1878 as a man passing through and had been here ever since, kept his arm around her and watched the stars come out one by one over the open plains, and felt, with every bit of himself that was capable of feeling anything, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The years that followed moved in the steady rhythm of a life being lived fully and well. Elias started school in 1886 and demonstrated, from his first week, the combination of curiosity and stubbornness that both his parents recognized without quite being willing to claim was the other one's contribution. He had a gift for reading that Pearl nurtured with the same patience she brought to her Saturday students, and by the time he was 8, he was reading from Tobias's legal books, not understanding most of it but clearly pleased by the seriousness of the attempt. Clara grew into a person of enormous will who was, by age 3, clearly the most decisive member of the household. She had Pearl's directness and Tobias's stubbornness, and the combination produced a small person who stated her opinions with remarkable clarity and required significant persuasion to change them, which both her parents found exhausting and admirable and deeply funny in the private conversations they had after the children were in bed. Hector turned 65 in 1888 and formally retired from the heavy ranch work, though retired in Hector's case meant that he did the lighter tasks and supervised and sat on the porch, and offered opinions on everything with the authority of someone who has earned the right to them. He had a room in the house now, not the bunkhouse he had used for years, because Pearl had insisted on this after a winter cold had settled in his chest and frightened everyone, and Hector had protested, and then accepted because Pearl's insisting was not something you could make much headway against. Tobias hired 2 good hands for the ranch work, brothers named Felix and Sam Arquette, who had come to Kansas from Louisiana and who were reliable workers and decent men. The question of race and its complications in the post-war Kansas of the 1880s was one Tobias and Pearl were not naive about. The world was still cruel in ways that the law was slowly and imperfectly addressing. And when some in town raised eyebrows at the Arquette brothers working and living on the Holloway ranch, Pearl managed those eyebrows with her characteristic combination of patience and absolute refusal to concede anything. The Arquette brothers stayed and proved themselves good for the operation, and Felix in particular had a way with cattle that Hector acknowledged as genuine talent, which was the highest endorsement available. Margaret Holloway, Tobias's sister, came for 2 weeks every summer as a fixed tradition, and her visits were some of the best 2 weeks of every year. She had not become a nurse. That path had closed for practical reasons, but she had married a good man named Arthur Webb, no relation to Caldwell's Aldous Webb, and had 3 children of her own, and she and Pearl had become the kind of friends who wrote long letters to each other between visits and saved things up to tell each other in person. Margaret told Tobias once that Pearl was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and Tobias said he knew, and Margaret said good, because she had been worried about him for years, and Tobias said he hadn't known that, and Margaret gave him the look that older sisters perfect over decades. The debt to Pruitt's firm had been paid. The ranch was clear. The legal practice was established. The children were growing. The North Slope held its grave with its low fence and its wildflowers that came back every spring without being planted, as if the land itself remembered what was owed to it. On a Sunday morning in the spring of 1890, Tobias rode up to the North Slope alone, which he did sometimes when he needed to think clearly or when something important was happening in the world he wanted to acknowledge properly. He tied Cass, who was gray around the muzzle now but still reliable, and stood beside the low fence for a while, the plains spreading out around him in every direction, the morning light coming across flat and golden. He thought about everything that had been built, the ranch and the practice and the children and the years, and he thought about everything that had been carried, Pearl's grief and his own drifting, and the long adjustment of finding out where you actually belong. He thought about what gratitude owed to luck, and what luck owed to the small choices stopping in the street, following someone to breakfast, writing a name in the inside of a hat. He had brought flowers, because Pearl had told him once that her mother liked wildflowers but also had had a preference for the purple ones, the kind that grew farther east, and Tobias had found some in a field 3 miles away and brought them without telling Pearl, because it was a thing he wanted to do just for the sake of doing it. He laid them by the stone and stood there in the Sunday morning with the wind in the grass. "I'm taking good care of her," he said to the morning, to the stone, to whatever might be listening. "I intend to keep doing that for a long time." The wind did what wind always does, moved through the grass, indifferent and intimate, the oldest sound on the plains. He rode back to the house. Pearl was in the yard with Clara, who was 6 and demanding to be shown how to do something she was not yet old enough to do safely, and Pearl was patiently explaining this with the same care she brought to long division. Elias was on the porch with a book, which was where he was most mornings. Hector was in his chair with his coffee and his opinions. Tobias dismounted and led Cass to the barn, and when he came back out, Pearl was walking toward him in the morning light with Clara on her hip and her hair loose from its pins in the Sunday morning way she had, and she looked at him with those amber eyes that still, after 12 years of knowing him, carried the same quality of clear attention. "You went to the slope," she said. She knew because she always knew. "I did," he said. She looked at him steadily for a moment, measuring whatever she was reading in his face. Then she shifted Clara to the other hip and reached up with her free hand and touched his face briefly, the way she did sometimes, not as anything formal but as acknowledgement. "Come have breakfast," she said. He followed her inside. The kitchen was warm. The biscuits were almost done. Elias came in from the porch with his book still open in one hand. Hector brought his coffee cup to the table. Outside, the spring morning was doing what Kansas springs do, filling the world up with light and possibility and the green smell of things beginning again. Tobias Holloway sat down at the table in the house his wife had fought to keep, in the town where he had arrived as a stranger and become something else entirely, and looked at his family gathered around the morning meal, and felt inside him the deep, settled weight of a life that had become exactly what it was supposed to be. Not what he had planned. Something better. Something he had ridden into by accident, drawn forward by a debt note in a breast pocket, and then by something he had no word for until he knew her name. And then the word was simple and enormous and contained everything. After breakfast, Pearl came to stand beside him at the window where he was watching Elias try to teach Clara something that Clara was declining to learn on her own timeline. And Pearl leaned against his shoulder and Tobias put his arm around her and they stood there, in the morning light, in the home they had built, with the whole of the rest of their lives still ahead of them and everything already enough, and more than enough, and whole. The hat hung on its peg by the door. It had lived a long time now, that hat, and it was tired at the brim and darker with years of use and weather. But the writing on the inside was still there, faded but legible, the one permanent record of the moment Tobias Holloway had understood something true about himself and made it real in the only private way available to a man sitting across a fire who is not yet ready to speak. Pearl Lockhart, 2 words that had become his whole life. He had come to collect a debt. He had left with nothing but her name written on the inside of his hat. And everything, and everything.